What would you do if the only thing you could afford turned out to be the one piece of land everyone else was afraid to touch? In 1883, a broke cowboy spent his last $3 on a ranch people called useless, a place with dead grass, a dry well, and a history no one wanted to talk about. But on his very first night, his horse refused to stay quiet, pawing at the ground like it was trying to warn him about something hidden beneath the dirt. What he uncovered would pull him into a secret buried for years, one powerful men were willing to burn, threaten, and even kill to keep hidden. So what exactly did that horse find? And why was it never meant to be discovered? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Let's begin the story. In 1883, the town of Red Creek sat alone in the wind-beaten stretches of Wyoming territory, a place that looked less like a settlement and more like something the land had reluctantly allowed to exist. There was one main dirt road cutting through it, lined with a handful of wooden buildings that had seen better days, a saloon with a swinging door that creaked in the wind, a general store with faded paint, and a small bank that seemed far too solid for a town this fragile. Dust hung in the air like it belonged there, carried endlessly by the dry wind rolling down from the distant hills. On a late afternoon, thick with heat and grit, a lone cowboy rode into town. His coat was worn thin at the shoulders, his boots scuffed from years of riding, and his hat pulled low enough to hide most of his face. The horse beneath him moved steadily, but without any show of pride, just quiet endurance. The man was Ethan Cole, a drifter who had spent years moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long, never owning anything he couldn't carry. Except for the horse. Ethan dismounted in front of the small land office beside the bank and tied the reins loosely. The horse, a dark brown gelding named Dusty, lowered its head and exhaled slowly, as if it too felt the weight of everything they had come through together. Inside the office, the air was cooler, but smelled of old paper and dry wood. Behind a worn desk sat an older man who barely looked up when Ethan entered. "You here to buy, or just passing through?" the man asked. Ethan stepped forward, setting a small pouch of coins onto the desk. "Heard there's land for sale." That got the man's attention. He reached beneath the desk and pulled out a folded document, sliding it across. "Ranch north of here, near Wind River Hills." Ethan opened the paper, scanning the rough map and the scribbled notes. "How much?" The man leaned back, slightly studying him with a faint smirk. $3. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond, not because it was too much, but because it was too little. "3," he repeated. "That's right," the man said. "Ain't cursed or nothing like that, just useless. Nobody's wanted it in years." Outside, through the open window, laughter drifted in from the saloon across the street. A few men had noticed the exchange and were watching. "Look at that," one of them called out. "Man's about to buy himself a patch of dead dirt." Another voice joined in. $3 for land like that. He's been robbed, and he don't even know it." The old man behind the desk shrugged. "You can walk away if you want." Ethan looked down at the paper again. $3 was almost everything he had left. But walking away meant going back to nothing. No work, no land, no place to stop running. He reached for the pen. "I'll take it." The man slid the document back, watched him sign, and took the coins without ceremony. Outside, the laughter grew louder as Ethan stepped back into the sun. "Hope you like ghosts," someone called. "Or rocks," another added. Ethan didn't respond. He untied Dusty, swung into the saddle, and turned the horse toward the northern road. As they left Red Creek behind, the noise faded into the wind. Dusty walked at an easy pace, hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. Ethan reached forward, resting a hand on the horse's neck. Well, he muttered quietly. Guess we own something now. Dusty flicked an ear back at him, then snorted softly as if acknowledging the words in its own way. The ranch sat nearly 2 miles north of town, where the land began to rise gently toward the Wind River Hills. By the time Ethan reached it, the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the dry grass. He slowed Dusty as the ranch came into view. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that felt like something had been left behind. The fence was half collapsed, its wooden posts leaning at odd angles, as if they'd given up holding anything in or out. The gate hung crooked, one hinge barely intact. Beyond it, the yard stretched out in uneven patches of dry, yellowed grass. The barn, or what remained of it, stood off to one side, its roof sagging and its walls warped from years of neglect. A small wooden house sat at the center of the property, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. And the well. It stood in the middle of the yard, and the rope frayed the bucket, missing the wood around it, cracked and gray with age. Ethan guided Dusty through the broken gate and came to a stop. For a long moment, he said nothing. It wasn't much. It wasn't even close. But it was his. He slid off the saddle and let the reins hang loose, giving Dusty room to move. The horse stepped forward, then paused, lifting its head and sniffing the air. Ethan began clearing a small space in the barn, pulling aside loose boards and debris to make room for Dusty to rest. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. When he returned to the horse and took hold of the reins, Dusty followed him a few steps, then stopped. Ethan tugged lightly. Come on. The horse didn't move. Instead, Dusty turned its head toward the western edge of the ranch, toward a section of fence that looked older than the rest. It stepped away from Ethan, moving slowly toward that spot, then lowered its head and stomped. Once, twice, again. Ethan frowned. What are you doing? Dusty snorted, pawing at the ground with more insistence. Ethan walked over, glancing down. There was nothing unusual, just hard dirt and scattered dry grass. Probably a rock, he muttered. He pulled the reins again, firmer this time, and after a moment Dusty relented and followed him into the barn. That night, Ethan slept inside the small wooden house, wrapped in a blanket against the creeping cold. The wind rattled the loose boards, whispering through the cracks in the walls. He thought about the laughter in town, about the $3, about the land. But eventually, exhaustion took over. Morning came with a pale light and the same dry wind. Ethan stepped outside, stretching his back, and went to check on Dusty. The moment he untied the horse, it moved past him straight toward the same spot near the western fence. Again it lowered its head. Again it stomped. Ethan followed, watching more closely this time. All right, what is it? Dusty sniffed the ground, then pawed at it, scraping away a thin layer of dirt. Ethan crouched, brushing the surface with his hand. Still nothing obvious. Just dirt, he said. He stood shaking his head and went back to work on the fence. Over the next few days, he stayed busy patching boards, clearing debris, trying to bring some life back into the place. But every time he let Dusty roam free, the horse returned to that same spot. Always the same, always digging, always watching him afterward. Ethan began to notice it more, and then one afternoon, something changed. He was driving a wooden post into the ground near the fence, when the hammer struck, and instead of the dull thud of wood and dirt, there was a sharp, hollow sound. Metal. Ethan froze. He struck again. The sound echoed slightly, unmistakable this time. He set the hammer down and knelt, pressing his ear closer as he tapped the ground with the handle. Clink, clink. Dusty stepped up behind him, snorted and stomped once more right where Ethan had been working. Ethan exhaled slowly. All right. Maybe you're onto something. He grabbed a shovel and began digging. The soil in that spot was harder than the rest, packed down like it had been disturbed and forced back into place. Each scoop took effort, but he kept going, sweat running down his back despite the dry air. Then the shovel struck something solid. Not rock, something flatter. Ethan dropped to his knees, clearing away the dirt with his hands. A weathered piece of wood began to emerge, darkened and soft from age. He cleared more. It wasn't just a plank. It was a surface, a cover, a door. Ethan sat back for a moment, staring at it. Well, I'll be. He worked around the edges, uncovering the full outline. The hinges, though rusted, were still visible. A hatch. He found a piece of iron nearby and wedged it under the edge, pulling with all his strength. The wood groaned. The hinges snapped. And with a final heave, the hatch gave way. A rush of cold, stale air rose up from below, carrying the damp scent of earth untouched for years. Ethan leaned over, holding his breath slightly as he looked down. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Behind him, Dusty shifted uneasily, letting out a low, uneasy sound. Ethan grabbed his oil lamp, struck a match, and lit it. The small flame flickered, casting long shadows across the opening. He hesitated only a moment. Then he started down. Each step creaked under his weight, the wood dry, but still holding. The light from above faded quickly, replaced by the dim glow of the lamp. At the bottom, the space opened into a low tunnel, and the walls packed tight with dirt. Ethan moved forward slowly. The air was colder here. He followed the tunnel for several yards until it widened into a small chamber. And there in the center sat a large wooden chest. It was coated in dust, the edges worn, the surface marked by time. Ethan approached, carefully setting the lamp beside it. Let's see what you've been hiding. He lifted the lid. No gold, no coins. Instead, stacks of papers tied in bundles. He picked one up, brushing off the dust. Maps, notes, measurements. Another bundled document stamped with official markings. Military. Ethan frowned, flipping through them. None of it made sense yet. At the bottom of the chest, he found a single sheet of paper more worn than the rest. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. There was only one line. They buried it to keep it quiet. Ethan stared at the words and the silence of the underground pressing in around him. Above, the wind moved faintly across the land. And for the first time since buying the ranch, Ethan understood one thing clearly. This place had never been useless. It had been hiding something. What do you think this ranch was really hiding beneath the surface? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're curious to uncover the truth with us, make sure to subscribe. Because what comes next is the most shocking part of the story. 2 days after Ethan discovered the hidden tunnel and the strange chest beneath his ranch, the quiet routine of his new life was broken. It happened early in the morning. The sun had barely risen over the Wind River hills when Dusty lifted its head and let out a low, uneasy snort. Ethan stepped out of the house, still pulling on his coat, and followed the horse's gaze. A rider was approaching. The man moved at a steady, controlled pace, his posture upright, his clothes clean, in a way that didn't belong to this land. As he drew closer, the contrast became clearer. He wore a dark vest, pressed trousers, polished boots, and gloves that had never seen a day of real work. Ethan didn't need an introduction. Walter Briggs, the man who owned the bank, the man who owned half the town. Briggs slowed his horse near the gate and took a long look at the ranch before dismounting. His eyes moved across the broken fence, the sagging barn, the dry well. And then, almost imperceptibly, They lingered on the western edge of the property, the exact place where Ethan had dug. Briggs removed his gloves, slowly dusting them off, as if the land itself offended him. "Well," he said, his voice smooth, almost polite. "You settling in?" Ethan crossed his arms, slightly leaning against the fence post. "Getting there." Briggs nodded, stepping closer, his boots barely making a sound on the dirt. "Not much to look at," he continued. "But I suppose a man with nothing might see things differently." Ethan didn't respond. There was a pause long enough to feel intentional. Then Briggs smiled faintly. "I'll make this simple. I'll buy it from you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Buy what?" the land, Briggs said. "The ranch. All of it." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "I just bought it." "I'm aware," Briggs replied. "That's why I'm here." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. $200. Ethan didn't even try to hide his reaction. 200 for something he had paid 3. "That's a generous offer," Ethan said slowly. "I try to be reasonable," Briggs answered. Ethan studied him for a moment. Why? Briggs tilted his head slightly. Why what? Why buy something nobody else wanted for years? For the first time, the smile faded just slightly. "Some things," Briggs said, "aren't worth much until they are." Ethan shook his head. "I just got here. I'm not selling." Briggs held his gaze for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then he nodded once. "Of course," he said quietly. "That's your choice." He turned, walking back toward his horse, but paused before mounting. "There's something you should understand," he added, his voice no longer warm. "Some land isn't meant to be disturbed." Ethan didn't answer. Briggs swung into the saddle and looked back one last time, as if making sure the message had settled. Then he rode off. Dusty shifted uneasily beside Ethan. Ethan watched until the man disappeared into the distance. Then he exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. "Something's not right." That afternoon, Ethan packed the documents from the chest into a cloth sack, tying it tightly. Whatever he had found beneath the ranch, it wasn't random. And Briggs had just confirmed it. He mounted Dusty and headed back toward Red Creek. The town looked the same as before, dusty, quiet, unchanged. But now it felt different. Ethan rode straight to the small schoolhouse near the edge of town. It was one of the few places that didn't revolve around money, drink, or survival. Inside, Clara Whitfield stood at a wooden desk sorting through papers. She looked up as Ethan entered, her expression shifting from curiosity to mild surprise. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," she said. Ethan set the sack on the table and untied it. "I need help," he said. Clara stepped closer, glancing at the contents. Her fingers paused when she saw one of the documents. "That seal," she murmured. She picked it up, brushing off the dust. "Where did you get these?" "Under my land," Ethan replied. Clara looked up sharply. Ethan told her everything: the hatch, the tunnel, the chest. As he spoke, Clara's expression grew more serious. "This isn't normal," she said quietly. "These aren't just records. Some of this is military." "That's what I figured," Ethan said. "I need to know who owned that land before me." Clara hesitated only a moment. "Come with me." She led him into a smaller room behind the main classroom. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, maps, and old files layered with dust. Clara began searching, pulling out worn books and flipping through pages carefully. After several minutes, she stopped. "I found it." She set a ledger down and turned it toward Ethan. "Jonathan Mercer." Ethan leaned in slightly. "Who was he?" "Not a rancher," Clara said. "A geologist. Independent. He bought your land in the late 1860s. She flipped a few pages. He spent years surveying the hills behind it, made detailed notes, measurements. He was looking for something. She pulled out another document. A report, she said, mentions a rare mineral deposit. Valuable? Ethan frowned. Gold. Clara shook her head. Doesn't say. She paused, then added quietly, the important part is missing. What do you mean, torn out? She said, turning the page. Whatever he found, it's not here anymore. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to him? Clara's expression darkened. That's the strange part, she said. In 1871, everything just stops. No sale, no transfer, no record of him leaving. Just gone. Clara nodded, like he vanished overnight. The room fell silent, and after that, Ethan asked. The land sat empty, Clara said. People avoided it, said it brought trouble. Ethan let out a slow breath. Yeah, he said. I'm starting to see why. He gathered the documents again, thanking Clara before heading out. By the time he returned to the ranch, the sun was already dipping low. This time, he didn't hesitate. He lit his lamp and went straight for the hatch. The air inside the tunnel felt colder than before. He moved past the chest and deeper into the darkness, into the part he hadn't explored yet. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to duck slightly. The smell changed too, less like earth, more like metal. Stronger. He reached the end of the passage and began digging. The soil here was different. Looser in some places, compacted in others, like it had been disturbed, and then buried again. Hours passed. Then clang. The sound echoed through the tunnel. Ethan froze. He cleared more dirt, his movements quicker now. Metal. He uncovered the surface of a large cylindrical container half buried. A barrel. He brushed away more dirt. Then another. And another. They were lined up side by side, buried deliberately. Each one sealed with heavy metal clasps. Some had markings, faded symbols, warning labels barely visible. Ethan tapped one lightly. A dull, solid sound. Not empty. Not treasure. Something else. He stepped back slowly, his breath steady but shallow. Not gold, he whispered. Dusty let out a sharp snort from above. Ethan looked at the barrels again, then remembered Briggs. The warning, the missing report, and the note. They buried it to keep it quiet. Ethan climbed back out of the tunnel and returned to the house. He spread Mercer's documents across the table, comparing maps with what he had just seen. The locations matched. Exactly. Mercer had known. But someone had made sure the truth never got out. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't abandoned, he said under his breath. It was hidden. Days later, the first real sign of danger appeared. It started with the water. At first, Ethan noticed a faint sheen on the surface of the well, like oil. Then the smell came. Sharp. Metallic. Wrong. Dusty refused to drink. Every time Ethan led him to the well, the horse turned away, restless, uneasy. Ethan crouched and scooped a bit of water into his hand. It felt off. Warmer than it should have been. He wiped it off quickly. This isn't good, he muttered. Then came the news. A child in Red Creek had fallen ill. High fever, weakness, no clear cause. But there was one detail. The child had been playing near the creek by the hills, drinking from it. Ethan stood in the middle of his yard when he heard. The pieces came together all at once. The barrels, the water, the sickness. This wasn't just a buried secret. It was spreading. He looked toward the western fence, the place where Dusty had been stomping from the very first day. The horse stood nearby, watching him. You knew, Ethan said quietly. Dusty shifted, ears flicking. Ethan exhaled slowly. If that stuff keeps leaking. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The ranch wasn't just his land anymore. It was a problem, a dangerous one. And now, it was his responsibility. That night, the wind came in low and restless from the hills, slipping through the cracks in the old ranch house and stirring the loose boards as if the place itself could not sleep. Ethan had been awake on and off for hours, lying on his cot, with Mercer's papers spread across the table in his mind, replaying the same questions over and over. Briggs knew something. Mercer had known something. And whatever had been buried under the ranch was already reaching the water. At some point past midnight, exhaustion finally pulled him under. Then the smell came. At first it was faint, just a thin thread of smoke slipping into his dreams. But within seconds, it thickened, heavy and bitter, turning the air sour in his lungs. Ethan's eyes opened. Before he could fully sit up, a violent crash exploded from outside. Dusty. The horse was thrashing in the barn hooves, slamming hard against the wooden floor leather straps, snapping tight, the sound sharp and frantic in the dark. Ethan threw off his blanket, yanked open the door, and stepped into the night, barefoot, half-dressed, heart pounding. A glow was rising behind the ranch. Orange, fast, hungry. No! He ran toward the western side of the property, and as he rounded the corner of the house, he saw it clearly. Flames were climbing out of the ground near the open hatch, licking up the dry grass, catching on old fence wood and dead weeds. The fire moved with terrifying speed, carried by everything the Wyoming summer had left brittle and ready to burn. Ethan grabbed the first bucket he could find, sprinted to the well, then swore when he remembered the water was barely usable. He scooped what he could anyway, then threw dirt with his hands, stomped at the edges, yanked burning brush aside with a shovel. Smoke stung his eyes and coated his throat. Sparks leapt toward the house every time the wind shifted. Come on, come on. But this was no accident. Not a stray ember, not lightning. Someone had lit the ground around that hatch on purpose. The realization hit him as hard as the smoke. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to scare him. They had wanted to destroy the tunnel, the papers, the evidence, maybe the ranch itself. If Dusty hadn't panicked when he did, Ethan might have slept until the flames reached the house. He was beating at a patch of fire with an old saddle blanket when movement caught his eye. A man stepped into view at the edge of the firelight. He wore a hat low over his face, but Ethan recognized him immediately. Jake Turner, Briggs's hired hand, the kind of man who smiled only when something hurt. Jake's right hand rested casually on the grip of his revolver. Ethan straightened slowly, breathing hard, face streaked with soot. You got some nerve showing up here. Jake took another step, his boots crunching over charred grass. You've been busy, cowboy. Ethan tightened his grip on the blanket. You set this. Jake ignored the question. His eyes drifted to the hatch, to the scorched earth, then back to Ethan. Mr. Briggs made you a fair offer, and I gave him a fair answer. Jake's mouth twitched. That land ain't worth dying for. Ethan took one step forward. What's under it? Jake gave a humorless laugh. You've already dug deeper than you should have. What is it? Ethan pressed. What did Mercer find? For the first time, something cold and open showed in Jake's face. Some secrets, he said, are worth more than the life of a broke cowboy. The words hung there in the smoke. Jake nodded once toward the hatch. You can still walk away. Sell the ranch. Leave Red Creek. You might even stay breathing. Ethan didn't move. Jake rested his thumb against the hammer of his revolver, just long enough to make the message clear. Next time, he said quietly, it won't just be fire. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark, beyond the flames, leaving Ethan standing there amid smoke ash and the bitter certainty that this had become far more dangerous than he had imagined. By dawn, the fire was out. But the ground around the hatch was blackened, the grass ruined, and part of the fence reduced to char. Dusty stood near the barn, sweat dark and restless, still lifting his head every few seconds, as if expecting something else to emerge from the dark. Ethan saddled him without a word and rode straight into Red Creek. The sheriff's office sat near the center of town, a square wooden building with a flagpole leaning slightly out front. Sheriff Thomas Hale was inside, seated behind a scarred desk, polishing his glasses when Ethan walked in. Hale looked up, took one glance at Ethan's smoke-stained clothes, and set the glasses down. "You look like hell. I had company last night." Ethan told him everything: the hidden tunnel, the chest, Mercer's papers, the buried metal barrels, the poisoned well, the fire, Jake Turner, the threat. Hale listened without interruption, elbows on the desk, face unreadable. But when Ethan said Briggs's name, something shifted in the room, small but unmistakable. The sheriff leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. "So it's Briggs now," he said at last. It was Briggs before Ethan said, "I just didn't know it yet." Hale rubbed his jaw. "You got proof Turner set that fire. I got burned ground boot tracks, and a man stupid enough to show his face while the fire was still burning. That won't hold in court." Ethan stepped closer to the desk. "He threatened me." "I'm not saying I don't believe you." "Then do something." Hale's jaw tightened. "You don't understand how this town works." "I understand enough. Briggs wants that land bad enough to burn me out." The sheriff rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, townspeople moved up and down the street, ordinary as ever. A wagon rolled by. Someone laughed near the saloon, life untouched by what was crawling beneath the hills. "Briggs owns the bank," Hale said quietly. "Half the people in this town owe him money. The other half owe him favors. He's got his hand in cattle grain land notes, freight contracts. If I arrest him without something solid, I don't just make an enemy of him. I split this town open." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "So that's it. I come in here and tell you a man tried to burn me alive, and you ask whether it's inconvenient?" Hale turned back, his voice lower now. "I'm telling you that if you go after Briggs, you're not going after one man. You're going after the system holding this place together." Ethan gave a bitter laugh. If this is what's holding it together, maybe it ought to break. For a second, something like respect flickered in Hale's expression. Then it was gone. "I'll keep an eye on things," the sheriff said. "That's what I can promise. That's not enough. It may have to be." Ethan stood there a moment longer, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. The sheriff wasn't going to save him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. As he turned to leave, Hale spoke again. "Cole." Ethan stopped. "Whatever you found out there," Hale said, "be careful. Men like Briggs don't panic unless there's something worth killing over." When Ethan returned to the ranch that afternoon, the light had changed. Storm-colored clouds had gathered far to the west, casting long gray shadows over the property. He was halfway through checking the burned ground near the hatch when he sensed he was no longer alone. A man stood near the fence. Older, straight-backed despite his years. He wore Lakota clothing marked by dust and weather, but there was nothing uncertain in the way he carried himself. His presence felt still and solid, like a tree that had stood through too many seasons to be moved by anything small. Dusty noticed him too, but instead of shying away, the horse only watched. Ethan stepped forward carefully. "Can I help you?" The man studied him for a moment. "You are the one who bought this land." It wasn't a question. "Yes." The man nodded once. "I am running elk." Ethan had heard the name before, usually spoken in town with lowered voices and old prejudice. Chief Running Elk led a Lakota camp that lived not far from Wind River Hills. "What do you want?" Ethan asked. Running Elk's eyes shifted briefly toward the blackened patch of ground near the hatch. "I heard you dug up what should not have remained buried." The bluntness of it sent a chill through Ethan. "You know what's under here. I know enough." Ethan hesitated, then gestured toward the shade beside the house. "Then maybe you'd better tell me." They sat outside the wind, moving softly through the grass. For a while, Running Elk said nothing. Then he looked toward the hills. "Many winters ago, he began our people notice the water changing." Ethan listened without interrupting. The stream that ran from those hills had always been clean. Then it began to taste strange. Animals refused it. Some of our people drank it anyway. They became weak. Their bodies failed them slowly, not all at once. Slowly enough for men in town to say it was something else. His voice never rose, but that only made it heavier. "We went to Red Creek. We warned them. They did not listen. Some laughed. Some said the land belonged to them now, and what happened on it was their concern, not ours." Ethan thought of the poisoned well, the sick child, the black barrels. Running Elk continued. "The ground here was poisoned long before you arrived." Ethan swallowed, and no one did anything. Running Elk looked at him sharply. Someone tried. He told Ethan about a white man who had come to the Lakota camp years earlier, carrying mapped soil samples and too much worry in his face. A man who had walked the hills and studied the water. A man who had asked careful questions, listened more than he spoke, and seemed horrified by what he found. Jonathan Mercer Ethan said quietly. Running Elk nodded. Mercer said the sickness came from what men had buried under the earth. He said the land itself had been made sick. He promised he would bring the truth to the town and to the men above the town. What happened to him? Running Elk's gaze drifted toward the horizon. He disappeared. Ethan was silent. He did not leave because he was afraid Running Elk said. He was not that kind of man. He vanished because someone wanted silence more than truth. The words landed with awful clarity. Mercer had discovered the buried waste. He had tried to expose it. Then he had been erased. And now Ethan had stepped into the same place. After Running Elk left, Ethan remained standing near the burned hatch for a long time, saying nothing. The pieces finally fit together so tightly they were impossible to separate. Mercer found the secret and vanished. The metal barrels had been buried on purpose. Briggs knew they were there, wanted the land back, was willing to buy, threaten, and burn for it. The water was changing again. The sickness that had once spread through Lakota families was beginning to return, first through the well, then through the creek, now through a child in town. If Ethan did nothing, all of it would happen again. He looked at Dusty, who stood not far away, ears turned toward him. "You were trying to tell me from the first night," he said softly. Dusty gave a low breath through his nose. Ethan turned back toward the hatch. There was no walking away now. He climbed down into the tunnel again, while the air still held the sour scent of smoke from the burned grass above. The boards near the entrance were blackened, the earth singed, but the deeper chamber remained intact. The barrels waited in the dark, half-exposed, silent and ugly. This time Ethan didn't come down as a curious man hoping to understand. He came down as someone who had already made his choice. He lifted the shovel, then started digging. He widened the earth around each barrel, uncovering more of them, exposing the full rows buried beneath the ranch. The work was brutal. The tunnel was tight. Sweat dripped into his eyes. The metal stench grew stronger the deeper he went. But he didn't stop. Each strike of the shovel carried a different weight now. Not curiosity, resolve. "If I leave you here," he muttered under his breath, driving the shovel in again, "you'll kill this whole valley." By the end of the first day, he had uncovered enough to know exactly what he was dealing with, not one or two barrels, but many. More than enough to poison the ground for years. So he kept going. For days, Ethan worked from dawn until the stars came out, hauling digging wrapping chains around the barrels, rigging a system of boards and pulleys to drag them up from the tunnel without breaking them open. It was dangerous work. Several barrels were rusted through in places. One groaned when shifted, and he froze for nearly a full minute before moving it again. Dusty pulled when Ethan asked, stepped carefully when the loads were uneven, and never once balked. By the end of it, an old wagon stood loaded with iron death. At first light, Ethan climbed onto the driver's bench and took the reins. Dusty leaned forward, and the wagon creaked into motion. They rolled into Red Creek slowly, heavily, every wheel turn groaning against the weight. It was early enough that the town was only beginning to stir, but by the time Ethan reached the main road, heads were already turning. People stopped sweeping porches. Men stepped out of the saloon with coffee in their hands. Women paused in front of the general store. Children stared wide-eyed at the wagon piled with sealed metal barrels. Ethan didn't stop. He drove straight through town and pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the bank. Walter Briggs's bank, the center of his power, the place every debt, every favor, every lie seemed to pass through. Dusty stamped once and stood still. Ethan climbed down every movement, calm and deliberate. He untied the cloth sack from the side of the wagon and turned to face the gathering crowd. "What in God's name is that?" someone asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He let the silence draw more people in. Then he opened the sack and pulled out Mercer's papers. "This," he said, his voice carrying farther than he expected, "came out of the ground under my ranch." More people gathered. I found a tunnel buried near the western fence. At the end of it was a chest. In that chest were maps, records, military papers, and Jonathan Mercer's notes. At the mention of Mercer's name, a murmur moved through the crowd. Ethan held up one of the papers. Mercer knew something had been buried out there. He knew it was dangerous. He tried to warn people. He turned and struck the side of one of the barrels with his hand. This is what he found. The crowd went quieter. These aren't treasure barrels. They aren't mining tools. They are poison, buried under that ranch years ago and left there to rot. A man near the back frowned. "What poison? I don't know every name for it," Ethan said. "But I know what it does. The well on my land turned foul. The creek by the hills made a child sick. The Lakota warned this town years ago that the water was changing, and nobody listened. Now the silence was complete." Ethan held up another page. "These maps show where Mercer surveyed the land. These notes show he found something buried and dangerous." And then he vanished. He let the implications settle. A few people had already turned to stare at the bank. The ranch wasn't useless, Ethan said. It was hidden. At that exact moment, a sharp metallic ping came from the wagon. Everyone flinched. One of the barrels had shifted slightly. A crack thin as a knife line opened across the rusted side. Then black liquid began to seep out. Slowly at first, then faster. It trickled down the iron, dripped off the wagon, and spread across the dirt street in a dark, oily ribbon. The smell hit, a second later, harsh, metallic, wrong enough to make people recoil instantly. "Back up," Ethan shouted. "Get back." The crowd stumbled away, panic racing through them far faster than any speech could. Women pulled children behind them. Men covered their mouths with sleeves. Someone shouted for water, then another shouted not to touch it. And just like that, what Ethan had been saying stopped sounding like accusation and started looking like proof. The bank doors slammed open. Walter Briggs stepped out. Gone was the smooth smile, the easy confidence. His face was pale with fury. "What have you done?" he demanded. Ethan turned to face him. "I brought your secret home." "Remove this wagon at once," Briggs snapped. "You're causing a panic." "No," Ethan said. "You did that when you buried this under the land and let it poison the water." Briggs's eyes flicked to the crowd, then to the papers in Ethan's hands, then to the leaking barrel. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know enough." Ethan raised Mercer's notes. He tried to tell people. "You made sure nobody heard him." That was the moment Briggs broke. He reached inside his coat, but before his revolver cleared the leather, another voice cracked across the square. "Don't." Sheriff Thomas Hale stood at the edge of the crowd gun, already drawn. Briggs froze. Hale moved closer, steady as stone. "Drop it." For one long second, no one breathed. Then Briggs slowly lowered the weapon. Hale stepped forward, took it from his hand, and looked him in the eye. "Walter Briggs, you're under arrest." The word struck the town harder than the gun ever could have. The most powerful man in Red Creek stood in the open street while Hale clapped irons around his wrists. Around them, the crowd stared in stunned silence. The balance of the town had just shifted under everyone's feet, and there was no putting it back. The rest happened fast. Mercer's documents were read publicly and copied. The missing pieces of his report were reconstructed from notes maps and half-burned pages. The truth emerged in fragments, but every fragment pointed in the same direction. Mercer had discovered a concealed waste project, tied to military operations and private land interests. He had tried to expose it. Then he disappeared. Within days, officials arrived from across Wyoming territory. Federal men followed not long after. The ranch, the tunnel, and the hills behind it were sealed off. Warning signs went up. The barrels were removed under armed guard and taken away for examination. Townspeople were ordered not to drink from the nearby creek. The well on Ethan's property was declared unsafe. Families living closest to the runoff were told to boil water, then later told not to touch it at all. The truth had come up out of the dirt, and now no one could pretend not to see it. But truth had a cost. The government declared Ethan's ranch unfit for habitation. The land he had bought for $3 was legally taken into restricted control. He no longer owned it in the simple way he once imagined, not as a home, not as a fresh start. Still, the officials made one thing clear. Had Ethan not found the buried site when he did, and had he not brought the barrels into the open, the contamination might have spread much farther before anyone acted. So they compensated him. It was more money than he had ever held in one place. Enough to leave. Enough to start over somewhere far from Red Creek. And for a little while, he thought about it. Then Chief Running Elk came back. They stood together on the rise above the old ranch as the late afternoon sun stretched long across the poisoned land. The men from the government will remove what they can, Running Elk said. But the land will not heal quickly. Ethan looked out over the property, over the black patch where the hatch had been, over the dead grass, over the broken barn that had once felt like hope. "No," he said. "It won't." Running Elk turned to him. "You can leave with your money." Ethan smiled faintly. "That what you'd do?" Running Elk's expression did not change. "No." A dry wind moved through the grass between them. "Our people know springs in these hills," Running Elk said. "Places where clean water still runs. There's work to do. Fences to move. New channels to cut. ground to watch, people to warn. He paused. If you stay, you do not stay as an owner. You stay as a man answering for what he found. Ethan looked down at Dusty standing quietly beside him. He thought about the first night, the stamping hoof, the patch of dirt, the old hatch, Mercer, the child in town, the fire, the crowd outside the bank, Briggs in chains. He thought about what would happen if everyone who saw wrong simply rode away. Then he nodded. I'll stay. So he did. Not for profit, not for land, not to become important. He stayed because the buried thing had changed more than the ranch. It had changed him. Weeks later, in the fading gold of another evening, Ethan stood on a hill above the old property, with Dusty beside him. The ranch below no longer looked like the useless patch of dead dirt the town had laughed at. It looked like the beginning of something difficult, ugly, necessary. Something honest. Dusty flicked his ears in the wind and stepped a little closer. Ethan rested a hand on the horse's neck. Well, he said quietly, looking out across the land, you were right. Below them lay the place where a secret had slept for years beneath dry Wyoming soil. And above it stood a broke cowboy who had bought a useless ranch for $3 and uncovered the truth buried under it. A year passed after the day Walter Briggs was led away in irons, and Red Creek never quite became the same town again. From a distance, it still looked like a frontier settlement clinging to the Wyoming wind on Main Street. Weathered storefronts, smoke rising from chimneys in the cold mornings, wagon tracks pressed into the dirt. But the feeling of the town had changed. Something in it had gone quieter, not calmer, just quieter, as if too many people had learned too much too fast. Some families had left before winter ended. Those who lived closest to the contaminated creek packed what they could and moved east or south, chasing cleaner water and safer soil. A few sold their homes for almost nothing. Others simply locked their doors and rode away before dawn, unwilling to raise children in a place where the ground itself had become suspect. But not everyone left. Some stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Some because they believed the worst was over. Some because frontier people were stubborn in ways that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with survival. The old bank building sat empty now. Its windows were boarded. The sign had been taken down, leaving only pale marks on the wood where the letters had once been. Children no longer ran past it shouting. Men no longer gathered at the steps to talk cattle loans and winter prices. It stood there like a dead tooth in the middle of town, a reminder of how much of Red Creek's strength had been built on rot. The saloon still opened every evening, but even there the noise never climbed quite as high as before. Conversations lowered when certain names came up. Laughter ended quicker. People watched each other a little more carefully now. A year earlier, Red Creek had been a town half asleep. Now it was awake and uncomfortable. Ethan Cole was no longer invisible in it. That too had changed. He no longer lived in the old ranch house, not since the government had sealed the core contamination zone and marked the land beyond it as restricted. Instead, he stayed in a small cabin built near the outer edge of the cordoned area, close enough to keep watch, far enough to avoid the worst of the poisoned ground. The cabin had been raised with the help of men from the Lakota camp and a few townsfolk who still believed practical work mattered more than resentment. Most mornings, Ethan was already outside by first light, moving fence posts, checking trenches, hauling timber, or riding the perimeter with Dusty. He worked with Chief Running Elk nearly every day. Not as a guest anymore. Not exactly his family either. But the old distance between them had thinned into something else, something built on shared labor and earned trust. Ethan had stopped feeling like a stranger on that land. Yet he knew he would never fully belong to either world. Not to the town that still looked at him with mixed gratitude and suspicion. Not to the Lakota camp, whose warnings should have been heard long before he arrived. People in Red Creek had begun to see him in two ways. To some, he was the man who had saved the valley, the one who refused to stay quiet, the one who exposed what Mercer had died trying to reveal, the one who dragged the buried poison into daylight before it could spread farther. To others, he was the man who brought ruin, the man who dug where no one had dug in years, the man whose questions had led to federal agents' land seizures, boarded Wells families leaving town, and a silence that hung over everything like winter frost. Both versions of him walked the same streets, and Ethan had learned not to argue with either one. The work of healing the land was slower than anyone wanted. By early spring, Ethan and Running Elk had begun cutting new channels from a cleaner spring farther north, digging long, narrow trenches by hand to divert fresh water into safer ground. They blocked old runoff routes with stone timber and packed earth, trying to keep contaminated seepage from reaching low fields. They marked suspect places with stakes and cloth strips. They hauled soil from cleaner ridges and spread it over scarred patches where nothing had grown in months. In the least damaged areas, they tried reseeding grass. Some of it held. Some of it died within a week. Nothing about the work was certain. There were no guarantees, no clean ending, no single day when the land suddenly looked healed. Some mornings, the soil seemed drier and stronger than the week before. Other days, a fresh patch of yellowing grass or a bitter smell in a drainage ditch reminded them how much damage had been buried under the surface. And through all of it, Dusty remained strangely essential. It was the horse more than once that kept them from making dangerous mistakes. There were places where Ethan thought the diverted water ran clear enough, only for Dusty to stop short, pin his ears, and refuse to drink. There were low stretches where the grass looked ordinary, but the horse would circle wide around them, nostrils flaring, body tense. Running Elk noticed it too, and began trusting the animal's instincts almost as much as Ethan did. "Some creatures hear what the earth is saying before men do," he remarked one afternoon. Ethan, tightening a rope around a post, only nodded. He heard it the first night. Still not everyone saw the work as progress. By summer, resentment had begun to simmer again in certain corners of Red Creek. One evening, Ethan stopped at the general store for lamp oil and flour. The room went quieter when he stepped inside. Not silent, just quieter in that deliberate way that let a man know he'd interrupted something being said about him. As he set his items on the counter, a voice behind him muttered, not softly enough to miss. Everything was fine before he started digging. Ethan didn't turn right away. He picked up the sack and only then looked back. The speaker was a ranch hand named Lowell Pierce, a narrow-faced man who had lost 2 calves that spring after they drank from a stream later marked unsafe. He wasn't drunk. That made it worse. "Was it?" Ethan asked. Lowell crossed his arms. "Town had water. Folks had land. Now we got fences and warning posts and men from Cheyenne telling us where not to breathe." Another man stared at the floor. No one interrupted. Ethan studied Lowell for a long second. "The poison was there before I ever touched the ground." Maybe Lowell snapped, but nobody had to know. That stayed with Ethan long after he left. A week later, the tension turned sharper. He was repairing a sluice barrier near the creek when a wagon approached too fast for the rough path. A man jumped down before it fully stopped. Ethan recognized him as Daniel Wren, the father of the boy who had fallen sick the year before. Wren's face looked older than it should have. "My son still can't run right," he said without greeting. "Still gets tired. Still wakes shaking some nights." Ethan set down his tools slowly. I know. No, you don't. Wren stepped closer, eyes glassy with rage, held too long. If you hadn't dug that hatch open, maybe none of this would have come loose again. Ethan felt the words hit harder than he expected. It was already leaking, he said quietly. You don't know that. I do. You believe that. Wren's hands shook. Everything was balanced before. Rotten, maybe. Hidden, maybe. But balanced. Then you tore it open. The accusation was unfair, and both men knew it. But unfair things often felt true when grief was talking. Ethan didn't answer right away, because somewhere deep beneath his anger, beneath his certainty, a harder question had begun to live. Had he done the right thing? Or had he shattered something fragile and forced the damage into the open before anyone was ready to bear it? That night, he sat outside his cabin long after dark, staring toward the sealed ranch land while Dusty grazed nearby. The horse lifted his head once, watching Ethan in the moonlight. You ever wonder if I made it worse? Ethan asked softly. Dusty did not answer, of course. But the question remained. The next strange sign came in late summer. It began the same way the first one had. Dusty stopped. Ethan had ridden out with him to inspect a northern ditch line several miles from the old ranch boundary where the land rolled into uneven grass and scattered stones. There was nothing remarkable about the place at first glance, just open country pale under the sun. Then Dusty halted mid-step. Not stubbornly, not from fatigue. Alertly, the horse lowered his head, sniffed once, and refused to move forward. Ethan sat straighter in the saddle. What is it? Dusty shifted sideways, tense through the shoulders, then pawed once at the ground. A cold feeling moved through Ethan's chest. He dismounted, tied the reins loosely, and knelt. The soil looked ordinary enough, but when he pressed his palm against it, the ground felt strangely firm, compacted in a way that didn't match the surrounding stretch. A few yards away, a narrow trickle of water wound between stones. Ethan cupped some into his hand and brought it close to his face. There it was, faint but unmistakable. That same metallic edge, not as strong as at the old ranch, but there. He stared at the little stream for a long moment, then grabbed the short spade from his saddle rig and began digging. He didn't go deep, only a foot or so. Then the blade struck something small and hard. He crouched lower, brushing away dirt with his fingers, and lifted out a thin, rusted fragment no larger than his hand. Metal. Curved, not natural. Part of a manufactured object. Ethan sat back on his heels, the fragment cold in his hand, despite the heat around him. No, he said under his breath. Dusty stood beside him, silent and watchful. When Ethan returned to the cabin, he pulled Mercer's papers back out of every surviving map note and survey sketch. By lantern light, he spread them across the table and marked the location where Dusty had stopped. Then he compared it to the old contamination map. His pulse slowed, then hardened. The new point was not inside the original burial zone. Not even close. He checked again. Measured distances. Reworked angles. Compared landmarks. Still the same answer. The fragment had come from somewhere outside the area everyone believed contained the buried waste. A possibility rose in his mind so dark, he almost rejected it on instinct. The barrels under the ranch had not been the only cache. He stood there in the silence, staring at the map while the lantern flame trembled. One hidden burial site had poisoned water, sickened children, and nearly broken a town. If there were more. By morning, the fear had become certainty enough to act on. He rode out to find running elk and laid the maps before him. The older man studied them quietly, then looked up at Ethan. You have found another wound. Ethan nodded. And if there's one more, there could be others. Running Elk's face did not change, but something in his eyes deepened. The men who buried poison under one hill do not usually stop at one hill. Together, they rode to the new site. Dusty led them there without hesitation this time, as if he remembered every wrong note in the land once he had heard it. They said little when they arrived. The wind moved through the grass. The little stream glinted under morning light. The place looked peaceful enough to fool anyone who didn't know what to look for. Ethan stood over the disturbed patch of soil and felt the scale of the thing open beneath him. This wasn't just buried once, he said at last. Dusty stood beside him, still and alert. Running Elk looked toward the distant hills. No, he said, and men who bury one lie usually bury another beside it. Ethan turned in a slow circle, taking in the sweep of land around them, the miles of grass stone, shallow water, hidden basins, abandoned survey paths, old military routes no one talked about anymore. The fight he thought he had finished in Red Creek had not ended. It had only changed shape. By the second year, Red Creek had begun to steady itself. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough that people could breathe without feeling every day might split open beneath them. A new water system had been built, in rough stages, drawing from cleaner sources farther away, and feeding into barrel stations and troughs marked safe by repeated testing. Some fields beyond the worst runoff zones had begun producing thin but usable crops again. A few families who had once considered leaving decided to stay. Others, hearing the town had survived the worst of it, came to see whether there might still be room to begin over. The relationship between the townspeople and the Lakota changed too, though slowly, and not without old prejudice, resisting every step. Shared work did what speeches never could. Men who once would not have sat at the same fire now dug ditches beside each other. Women traded seed and cloth. Children with less history to unlearn adapted fastest of all. And in the middle of that uneasy new ground stood Ethan, no longer a drifter, no longer the man people laughed at for buying dead land. Now when he spoke in town meetings or argued for moving a fence line or changing a water route, people listened. Not because he held office, not because he wanted power, but because he had been right once in a way no one could ignore. Still, he lived simply. The same worn hat, the same rough work clothes, the same habit of waking before dawn. Dusty remained at his side, through all of it, older now, maybe a little slower, but no less sharp. The horse had become almost a legend among those who knew the story. Some children in town called him the Truth Horse, half joking, half reverent. Ethan never corrected them. Through the second winter, he kept studying Mercer's papers. Most had already been copied and turned over to investigators. But a few damaged pages and personal notes remained in his keeping fragments too partial or water-stained to matter much at first glance. One bitter night, while the wind hammered the cabin walls and Dusty shifted in the lean-to outside, Ethan sat at the table going through those scraps again. A torn page slid loose from between two survey sheets. He almost missed it. The paper had been folded into a seam, hidden so tightly it looked like part of the binding damage. Ethan carefully eased it free and spread it under the lamp. At first it seemed meaningless. Half lines, partial symbols, abbreviated markings, distances without labels. But when he overlaid it against Mercer's larger map, then matched the notation style to other pages, his breath caught. The fragment fit, not with the ranch survey, with something wider, much wider. For hours Ethan worked in silence, sorting, aligning, comparing landmarks, tracing faint ink where Mercer's hand had once moved faster than fear. One by one the disconnected marks began to connect. Not one burial point, several. A chain of sites stretching far beyond Red Creek, across Wyoming territory. The realization sat in the room like another person. Mercer had not just discovered a single buried cache. He had uncovered a system, something organized, intentional. Not one accident hidden in one desperate place, but a network of disposal grounds placed across remote land, likely where poor settlements, tribal lands, or forgotten ranch country made resistance easy and silence cheaper. Ethan leaned back, slowly staring at the assembled map. This was bigger than Briggs, he whispered. Briggs had been a keeper of one gate, not the whole machine. The next day he showed Running Elk. The chief studied the reconstructed map for a long time before speaking. So he said at last the sickness was planted in many places. Ethan nodded. Mercer found this before he disappeared. And now you have found what he was trying to carry. That word carry stayed with Ethan, because that was what it felt like. A burden, a truth too large for one town, one ranch, one good deed, one arrest. And with it came a final choice. He could stop. He had enough money from the compensation to leave. He could buy clean land in Montana or Colorado, take Dusty and spend the rest of his life working honest soil under an honest sky. He had done more than most men would have done, more than anyone could fairly ask of him. Or he could continue. He could follow Mercer's map, find the remaining sites, pull the truth into daylight again and again until someone powerful enough was finally forced to answer for all of it. But if he did that, Red Creek would not be the end of the fight. It would only be the beginning. One evening, standing above the creek at sundown, Ethan laid the map across a flat stone while Running Elk watched the light fade over the hills. If I go after this, Ethan said, I may not come back to anything simple. Running Elk nodded as though simplicity had never been part of the world to begin with. You could stay, he said. Live quietly. Let other men discover the rest in their own time. And if they don't, the chief's gaze stayed on the horizon. Then others will drink what should never have touched their mouths. Silence stretched between them. At last, Running Elk said, some truths are not meant to be carried alone. Ethan looked down at the map again. No, they weren't. But sometimes someone still had to lift them first. Later that night, he stood beside Dusty beneath a sky thick with stars. The horse turned his head slightly, ears forward, waiting. Ethan rested a hand along his neck. If I stop now, he said quietly, someone else pays for it. Dusty breathed out. And if I keep going, he didn't finish that either, because the cost of continuing was impossible to measure. Men bigger than Briggs might still be tied to those sites. The same kind of silence that swallowed Mercer might still be waiting along the trail. Yet when Ethan looked toward the dark line of hills beyond Red Creek, he already knew. By dawn, he had packed Mercer's reconstructed map, a bedroll, dried food, tools, a spare revolver cylinder, a notebook. Nothing more than a man needed to travel light and keep moving. Dusty stood saddled before the sun had fully risen, calm, as if he had known all along this was coming. Ethan turned once before mounting. Red Creek lay behind him in the early morning stillness, smaller than it once seemed, sadder in some ways, stronger in others. A town altered by buried poison, by truth, by pain, by survival. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said almost to himself, $3 bought me land, but it also bought me the truth. He climbed into the saddle, folded Mercer's map inside his coat, and touched his heels lightly to Dusty's sides. The horse stepped forward without hesitation. Together, they rode away from Red Creek toward the wider silence of Wyoming territory, toward the places no one had mapped honestly, toward the buried wounds still waiting under open land, toward a truth that had not ended with one ranch or one town. And as the morning light spread over the grass, Ethan understood something with complete clarity. He had never really bought a useless ranch at all. He had bought the first piece of a story the Earth had been trying to tell for years. Thank you so much for watching and staying with this story until the end. Your support truly means everything. If you enjoyed it and want more powerful stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next journey.